The morning sun of April 18th, 1943, rises over the Solomon Islands, casting long shadows across the emerald waters of the South Pacific. In precisely 17 minutes, the Imperial Japanese Navy will suffer its most devastating personal loss of the Pacific War. 6 elite Zero pilots, hand-picked for the highest honour of their careers, are about to experience the most catastrophic failure in Japanese naval aviation history. This is not merely a story of an ambush. It is an examination of why 6 of Japan's finest fighter pilots, flying the most celebrated aircraft of the Pacific theatre, failed to protect the one man whose survival mattered more than any fleet, any island, or any battle. The question that haunts military historians to this day remains deceptively simple yet profoundly complex. How did 6 experienced Zero pilots, specifically chosen for their skill and positioned in defensive formation, fail to prevent 2 American bombers from being shot down in broad daylight? The answer reveals not just a tactical failure, but a perfect storm of technological limitations, strategic miscalculations, and fatal assumptions that would cost Japan its most brilliant naval strategist. Today we will dissect every element of this failure, from the technical specifications of the aircraft involved to the split-second decisions that sealed Admiral Yamamoto's fate. While history books chronicle Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's death as a triumph of American intelligence and planning, few examine the Japanese perspective with the scrutiny it deserves. The 6 Zero pilots who flew that day have been relegated to footnotes, nameless escorts who simply failed. But these were not ordinary pilots. They were combat veterans of the 204th Naval Air Group, men who had survived the meat grinder of Guadalcanal, who had faced American fighters dozens of times and lived to tell about it. Their failure was not born of incompetence or cowardice, but of systemic problems that plagued the Imperial Japanese Navy's fighter doctrine, problems that would only become apparent in the crucible of that April morning. The central question we must answer is not simply what happened, but why it was allowed to happen. Why did Japan's premier fighter aircraft, the Mitsubishi A6M30, piloted by some of the Navy's most experienced aviators, prove incapable of executing what should have been a routine protective mission? The answer lies in a complex web of technical limitations, doctrinal failures, and a fundamental misunderstanding of how aerial warfare had evolved by 1943. The mission occurred just 2 days after the conclusion of Operation One Go, Yamamoto's last major offensive operation, when the Admiral was flying to congratulate the units that had participated. At Rabaul's Lakunai airfield, the morning of April 17, 1943, brings an unusual tension to the ready room of the 204th Naval Air Group. 6 pilots are summoned for a special briefing, one that immediately sets this mission apart from the endless patrols and scrambles that have defined their war thus far. The selected men represent experienced naval aviators. Lieutenant Junior Grade Takeshi Morisaki, a section leader with over 2 years of combat experience. Petty Officer First Class Shoichi Sugita, already an ace with approximately 30 victories. Chief Petty Officer Yoshimi Hidaka, a 20-victory ace whose tactical acumen has kept him alive through the bloodiest air battles over Guadalcanal. Petty Officer First Class Kenji Yanaga, credited with 8 kills and known for his exceptional gunnery. Petty Officer First Class Toyomitsu Tsujinue, a steady veteran with nerves of steel, and Petty Officer Second Class Yasushi Okazaki, younger than the others but already proven in combat. Commander Tadashi Nakajima of the 204th Air Group personally delivers the briefing. Tomorrow, these 6 pilots will have the supreme honour of escorting Admiral Yamamoto himself on an inspection tour to Bougainville. The gravity of this assignment cannot be overstated. Yamamoto is not merely a fleet commander. He is the architect of Japan's naval strategy, the mastermind of Pearl Harbor, and perhaps the only Japanese leader who truly understands both Japan's capabilities and limitations in this war against the industrial might of America. The pilots understand immediately that this is not just another mission, but a sacred trust. The Admiral is flying to visit bases at Balale and Buin to congratulate the pilots who had just completed Operation Ringo. What the Japanese pilots preparing their aircraft at Rabaul cannot know is that 1,600 miles away at Pearl Harbor, American cryptanalysts have just achieved one of the intelligence coups of the war. On April 14th, multiple American radio intercept stations detected a Japanese naval message designated NTF 131755, encoded in the JN25D cipher, that American codebreakers had been steadily unravelling since before Midway. The message, addressed to the commanders of Base Unit No. 1, the 11th Air Flotilla, and the 26th Air Flotilla, contains something unprecedented: a detailed itinerary of Admiral Yamamoto's upcoming inspection tour, complete with departure times, arrival times, and exact routing. At Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, the decrypt reveals Yamamoto's schedule with minute precision. Departure from Rabaul at 0600 hours, arrival at Balal Island airstrip at 0800 hours, surface to Shortland Island by subchaser at 0840, arrival at Shortland at 0940, lunch with senior officers, departure from Shortland at 1400, return to Rabaul by 1540. The American intelligence officers can hardly believe their fortune. The Japanese, with their obsession for detailed planning and punctuality, have inadvertently provided a perfect blueprint for an assassination. Admiral Chester Nimitz himself must approve what comes next, and after consulting with Washington, the decision is made: Yamamoto must be eliminated. At Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, the planning for Operation Vengeance begins with a sobering mathematical reality. The distance from Guadalcanal to the interception point near Bougainville is 420 miles, at the absolute limit of the P-38 Lightning's range, and only achievable with auxiliary fuel tanks and perfect navigation. Major John Mitchell, commanding the 339th Fighter Squadron, works through the night of April 17th with his operations staff, calculating fuel consumption rates, wind speeds, and the precise timing needed to intercept Yamamoto's flight at the only point where it will be within range and at low altitude. The plan that emerges is audacious in its precision. 18 P-38s are assigned to the mission, though only 16 will actually fly after 2 aircraft develop mechanical problems during startup. These 16 P-38s will fly a carefully calculated route that keeps them beyond the range of Japanese radar and coast watchers, maintaining complete radio silence and flying at wave-top height to avoid detection. The flight path consists of 5 legs, each precisely timed. Any deviation, any mechanical failure, any navigational error will result in mission failure. The intercept is calculated for 0935 hours, giving the Americans exactly 15 minutes of combat time before fuel considerations force them to turn for home. The 6 Zero pilots preparing their A6M3 Model 22 fighters at Rabaul represent the evolution of Japan's most famous fighter aircraft. But by April 1943, evolution has become a liability. The Zero that stunned the world in 1940 was revolutionary, a perfect synthesis of range, maneuverability, and firepower, achieved through radical weight reduction. Every component was scrutinized for excess weight. The aircraft featured no armor protection for the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks, and a structure built to the absolute minimum strength requirements. The result was a fighter that could outmaneuver anything in the sky, with a range that seemed impossible for a carrier-based fighter. But by 1943, the Zero's design philosophy has become its Achilles heel. The A6M3 variant these pilots fly has attempted to address some weaknesses: a more powerful Sakai 21 engine producing 1,130 horsepower, improved high-altitude performance, and slightly better diving speed, but the fundamental vulnerabilities remain. The Zero still lacks pilot armor, still carries fuel in unprotected tanks that turn the aircraft into a flying torch when hit, and most critically for the mission ahead, still lacks the speed to catch or escape from the new generation of American fighters. The A6M3 Model 22 has a maximum speed of 388 miles per hour at 19,690 feet. The P-38 Lightning that will attack them tomorrow can achieve 414 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, outdive it without fear of structural failure, and carries enough firepower to destroy a Zero with a single burst. The defensive formation the Japanese will employ tomorrow reflects doctrine developed in China against inferior opposition, not the reality of 1943. The standard defensive position places the fighters above and behind the bombers they protect, ideal for diving onto attackers approaching from above, the classic fighter attack profile. But this formation has a fatal blind spot. It cannot adequately protect against attackers coming from below and behind, exactly the approach the Americans have planned. The Zero pilots will position themselves at approximately 6,500 feet, about 1,500 feet above the two Mitsubishi G-4M Betty bombers from the 705th Air Group, bomber number 323 carrying Admiral Yamamoto, and bomber number 326 carrying Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki and other staff officers, scanning the sky for threats they expect to come from above, while death approaches from below. As the Japanese formation approaches Bougainville at 0930 hours, the 6 Zero pilots maintain their vigilant watch on the sky above and ahead. This is where threats always come from, diving out of the sun, using altitude advantage to build speed for a single slashing attack. Lieutenant Morisaki, leading the escort, positions his two sections perfectly according to doctrine, maintaining spacing that allows mutual support while covering the largest possible area of sky. They are now over the jungle of Bougainville, the airfield at Balal visible in the distance, perhaps 5 minutes from landing. The most dangerous part of the journey is nearly over, but the threat does not come from where they expect. At 0934 hours, Mitchell's top cover flight spots the Japanese formation exactly where predicted, 2 bombers and 6 fighters in perfect formation, completely unaware of the 16 P-38s approaching from the south at treetop height. Mitchell keys his radio for the first transmission in over 2 hours. Bogies, 11 o'clock high. Captain Thomas Lanphier, leading the killer flight, cannot believe their luck. The Japanese are exactly on schedule, exactly where expected, and completely oblivious to the danger below. The P-38s jettison their drop tanks and begin their attack. What happens next occurs with such speed that participants will argue about the exact sequence for decades. The Zero escort, scanning the sky above and the ocean horizon, fails to spot the olive-drab P-38s climbing from below until they are already within gun range. The American fighters, painted in dark olive and grey, blend almost perfectly with the jungle backdrop, a camouflage scheme developed specifically for the Southwest Pacific that proves devastatingly effective. By the time Petty Officer Yanaga, flying the outermost position on the right side of the formation, spots the approaching P-38s and shouts a warning, Lieutenant Rex Barber is already within 50 yards of Yamamoto's bomber, his finger on the trigger. Barber's attack is textbook perfect. Approaching from the bomber's 7 o'clock position, below and behind where the tail gunner cannot depress his weapon enough to engage, he opens fire with all 4.50 caliber machine guns and his 20mm cannon. The concentrated firepower tears into the Betty's right engine, right wing root and fuselage. In his after-action report, Barber will describe seeing the bomber's right engine begin streaming black smoke and white vapour, oil and fuel, as his shells find their mark. He continues firing as he closes, shifting his aim to the left engine, seeing pieces of the aircraft's skin peel away under the impact of his rounds. Inside the bomber's fuselage, 1.50 caliber bullet, among the hundreds fired, enters through the thin aluminum skin and strikes Admiral Yamamoto in the left shoulder, traversing his body and exiting under his right eye, killing him instantly. The Zero pilots react with the speed of combat veterans, but it is already too late. Lieutenant Morisaki rolls his fighter inverted and pulls through a split S, diving toward the P-38s with his wingman following, but they are starting from 1,500 feet above and behind the action, a geometry that makes intervention impossible. The simple physics of acceleration and distance mean that even diving at full throttle, pushing their Zeros to the structural limits, they cannot reach the Americans before the fatal damage is done. Chief Petty Officer Hidaka, leading the right side section, banks hard toward Barber's P-38, but the American is already pulling away from the mortally wounded bomber, using the Lightning's superior speed to escape before the Zeros can bring their weapons to bear. Yamamoto's bomber, mortally wounded, noses down toward the jungle with its right engine in flames. The pilot, Warrant Officer Takeo Kotani, fights desperately to maintain control, but with one engine destroyed and the control surfaces damaged, the aircraft is doomed. The Betty crashes into the jungle canopy at 0938 hours, just 4 minutes after the first sighting of American fighters. The second bomber, carrying Vice Admiral Ugaki, attempts to escape toward the ocean but is caught by Lieutenant Besby Holmes, who damages it severely. This aircraft also crashes, though Ugaki will miraculously survive, pulled from the wreckage with serious injuries. Only Petty Officer First Class Kenji Yanaga manages any form of retaliation. As the P-38s disengage and turn south toward Guadalcanal, he spots one Lightning struggling behind the others, trailing smoke from one engine. This is Lieutenant Raymond Hines' aircraft, damaged either by defensive fire from the bombers or during combat. Yanaga pursues the wounded Lightning, closing to gun range and firing repeated bursts from his 20mm cannon. He observes strikes on the P-38's wing and fuselage, sees fuel streaming from punctured tanks, but the rugged American fighter continues flying, its surviving engine pulling it toward home. The pursuit continues for several minutes before Yanaga must break off. He is now far from Bougainville, low on ammunition, and other P-38s might turn back to protect their damaged comrade. He turns back toward Balali Airfield, where the other 5 Zero pilots have already landed, their aircraft undamaged but their mission a catastrophic failure. Hines' P-38 will never reach Guadalcanal. He disappears over the ocean, the only American loss of the mission. But this single victory cannot alter the fundamental reality. The Imperial Japanese Navy's most important leader is dead, killed while under the protection of 6 of the 204th Air Group's experienced fighter pilots. The failure of the Zero escort on April 18, 1943, cannot be understood without examining the fundamental technological mismatch that had developed by this stage of the Pacific War. The A6M0, revolutionary in 1940, was by 1943 operating on borrowed time against increasingly superior American aircraft. The very design philosophy that made the Zero dominant early in the war, radical weight reduction to achieve superior range and maneuverability, had become a fatal weakness against opponents who had learned to exploit its limitations. The Zero's lack of armor protection meant that even glancing hits could kill or incapacitate the pilot. The absence of self-sealing fuel tanks turned the aircraft into flying incendiary bombs when struck by incendiary rounds. Most critically for the Yamamoto mission, the Zero's maximum speed of 388 miles per hour and poor high-speed handling characteristics meant it could neither catch nor escape from the new generation of American fighters. The P-38 Lightning, with its twin engines producing a combined 2,800 horsepower compared to the Zero's single 1,130 horsepower engine, could dictate the terms of any engagement, choosing when to attack and when to disengage at will. The defensive formation employed by the Zero escort reflected tactics developed against Chinese opponents flying obsolete aircraft in the late 1930s. The positioning of fighters above and behind the bombers they protected made perfect sense when the primary threat was other fighters diving from altitude to attack. This formation allowed the escorts to maintain energy advantage while keeping visual contact with their charges. But by 1943, American tactics had evolved far beyond the simple diving attacks of the war's early months. The American adoption of the boom and zoom technique, using superior speed to make single high-speed passes rather than engaging in turning dogfights, rendered traditional Japanese defensive formations obsolete. The P-38s attacking from below could use their speed advantage to strike before the Zeros could react, then escape before the Japanese fighters could bring their superior maneuverability to bear. The Japanese had no effective counter to this tactic with the Zero, as the aircraft simply lacked the speed to pursue or escape from hit-and-run attacks. Perhaps the most damaging failure was the complete lack of awareness that American forces had broken Japanese naval codes. The detailed itinerary broadcast 4 days before Yamamoto's flight might as well have been sent directly to Admiral Nimitz's headquarters. The Japanese confidence in their code security was so complete that they never considered the possibility that the Americans might be reading their most secret communications. This overconfidence extended to the planning of Yamamoto's flight. No diversionary measures, no last-minute route changes, no additional security precautions despite flying the Navy's most important leader through an active war zone just 2 days after the conclusion of Operation Oigo. The 6-0 pilots land at Balal airfield in shocked silence. There is no immediate blame, no accusations of cowardice or incompetence. Everyone understands that they faced an ambush prepared with intelligence they could not have anticipated. But the weight of failure is crushing. They were selected for the highest honor imaginable, protecting Admiral Yamamoto, and they failed. In the rigid hierarchy of Japanese military culture, where responsibility and shame are collective rather than individual, all 6 pilots understand that their lives are now defined by this single catastrophic failure. At Rabaul, the news of Yamamoto's death spreads through the naval air groups like a physical blow. The Admiral was more than a commander. He was the embodiment of Japanese naval power, the one leader who truly understood both Japan's potential and its limitations. His death represents not just a tactical loss, but a psychological catastrophe. Morale, already battered by months of attrition in the Solomons, plummets further. The Japanese High Command immediately classifies all details of Yamamoto's death as top secret. When the Japanese public is finally informed on May 21, 1943, they are told only that the Admiral died while directing operations at the front. On June 5, 1943, Japan holds a state funeral for Admiral Yamamoto, an honor reserved for the nation's greatest heroes. The ceremony in Tokyo is attended by the Emperor himself, and the entire nation observes a moment of silence. For the 6-0 pilots at Rabaul, the funeral represents a formal acknowledgement of their failure. 2 days after the funeral, on June 7th, the Japanese launch a massive air offensive against American positions in the Solomons, specifically targeting the Russell Islands. The mission involves 81 Zeros, 12 carrying firebombs, the rest providing escort, from the 204th Air Group. During this June 7th raid, 2 of the Yamamoto escort pilots meet their end. Chief Petty Officer Yoshimi Hidaka is shot down and killed during the 90-minute battle that sees 23 to 24 Japanese aircraft lost against approximately 50 Allied fighters. Petty Officer Second Class Yasushi Okazaki also dies in the same engagement. Both pilots flew Zeros armed with firebombs under their wings, pressing their attacks through intense anti-aircraft fire. Their deaths mark the beginning of what would become a pattern, the Yamamoto escorts seeking redemption through combat. During the same June 7th raid, Petty Officer First Class Kenji Yanagia's war takes a different turn. After completing his bombing run on Russell Island, 2 F-4F Wildcats catch his Zero in a climbing turn. Despite desperate evasive maneuvers, American .50 caliber rounds smash into his cockpit. One bullet strikes his right hand as it grips the control stick, destroying it almost completely. Only his small finger remains attached. Another round tears through his right leg, severing arteries and filling his flight boot with blood. Somehow, Yanagia maintains consciousness and control of his aircraft using only his left hand. Fighting against shock and blood loss, repeatedly shouting to keep himself awake, he manages to fly his crippled Zero to the Japanese base at Munda. Unable to lower his landing gear with his destroyed right hand, he belly lands on the coral runway. Japanese Marines pull him from the cockpit more dead than alive, immediately amputating what remains of his right hand. Against all odds, he survives and is evacuated to Japan, his war over but his life preserved. On June 16, 1943, Lieutenant Junior Grade Takeshi Morisaki, the escort flight leader, is killed while attacking Allied transports off Lunga Point, Guadalcanal. He dies alongside Squadron Leader Lieutenant Zenjiro Miyano during another raid against American shipping. Morisaki's death, coming just 9 days after Hidaka and Okazaki, leaves only 2 of the original 6 escorts still flying. On July 1, 1943, Petty Officer First Class Toyomitsu Tsujinue goes missing in action during an escort mission for dive bombers attacking the Allied anchorage at Rendova Island. He is never seen again, his fate unknown. With Tsujinue's disappearance, only one member of the original escort remains in combat, Petty Officer First Class Shoichi Sugita. Shoichi Sugita, already credited with approximately 30 victories when Yamamoto died, chooses a different interpretation of redemption. Rather than seeking immediate death like his comrades, he decides that destroying American aircraft represents better atonement than a single glorious death. Throughout the summer of 1943, Sugita continues to add to his score in the skies over the Solomon Islands. By August, he has raised his tally to approximately 40 victories, becoming the leading ace in the Solomon Islands campaign. In August 1943, Sugita's first close call with death comes when his Zero is caught by American fighters while attacking bombers. His aircraft is hit in the engine and catches fire. In an act that most Japanese pilots would consider shameful, Sugita bails out of his burning fighter, parachuting down into Japanese-held territory with severe burns. After treatment, he is evacuated to Japan for recovery, temporarily ending his combat career. By March 1944, after 7 months of recovery, Sugita returns to combat as a Petty Officer Second Class with the 263rd Air Group in Guam. The Pacific War has shifted dramatically in his absence. The Americans have seized the Marshall Islands, neutralized Truk, and are preparing to assault the Marianas. In June 1944, his unit merges with the 201st Air Group in the Philippines, which is reorganized as the first official kamikaze unit under Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi. Sugita refuses kamikaze missions and is ordered back to Japan. In June 1944, Sugita participates in what the Americans will call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the aerial component of the Battle of the Philippine Sea. On June 19th, Japanese naval aviation launches its largest carrier operation since Midway. The result is catastrophic. American fighters and anti-aircraft guns destroy over 300 Japanese aircraft. Sugita survives when his unit, the 263rd Air Group, is essentially annihilated. 6 aircraft attempt to escape to Guam, but are ambushed by F-6F Hellcats. 5 are shot down immediately. Sugita's Zero, hit repeatedly with navigation equipment destroyed, somehow makes it to a Japanese base on Rota, the sole survivor of his entire unit. In January 1945, now a Chief Petty Officer, Sugita joins the elite 301st Fighter Squadron of the 343rd Naval Air Group at Kanoya Air Base in Kyushu. By this time, he has accumulated 70 officially credited victories. On April 15, 1945, almost exactly 2 years after Yamamoto's death, American carrier aircraft attack Kanoya. F-6F. Hellcats from USS Independence and USS Randolph catch the 343rd Air Group during takeoff. Sugita's Kawanishi N-1K2J Shidenkai fighter is hit just as it becomes airborne, crashing just beyond the runway. He dies instantly at age 20, having survived longer than any other combat pilot from the Yamamoto escort, but never achieving the redemption he sought. In Japan, Kenji Yanaga undergoes a long recovery from his June 7, 1943 wounds. The amputation of his right hand ends any possibility of returning to combat. Promoted to warrant officer and assigned as an instructor at Kasumigaura Naval Air Station, he trains new pilots for the remainder of the war. When Japan surrenders on August 15, 1945, Yanaga is one of approximately 5,000 surviving Japanese naval aviators from the more than 25,000 who served during the war. After the war, Yanaga returns to Tokyo and finds work in a small trading company. For nearly 3 decades, he tells no one about his role in the Yamamoto mission. The burden of being the sole survivor of the escort remains a private shame he cannot share. In the mid-1970s, Japanese aviation historian Akira Yoshimura, researching a book about the Yamamoto mission, discovers through investigation that one escort pilot survived the war. He tracks down Yanaga, now in his 50s, working in Tokyo. Through multiple interviews, Yanaga's story emerges for the first time. The selection for the mission, the pride of being chosen, the formation over Bougainville, the devastating speed of the American attack, the impossible physics of intervention. Yanaga provides the first Japanese perspective on the mission's failure. He describes how the P-38s appeared from an unexpected angle at an unexpected time, how the Zero escort was positioned according to doctrine that proved inadequate, how the American fighters were faster and executed their attack with perfect timing. He emphasizes that it was nearly impossible to protect 2 bombers from 16 P-38s with only 6 Zero fighters. On April 15 to 17, 1988, the National Museum of the Pacific War, Admiral Nimitz Museum in Fredericksburg, Texas, organizes a symposium commemorating the 45th anniversary of Operation Vengeance. 8 surviving American pilots attend, and through Japanese contacts, they extend an invitation to Yanaga. He accepts, making his first trip to America at age 68. Contemporary newspaper accounts from the Deseret News explicitly identify the lone Japanese attending the meeting was former Zero pilot Kenji Yanaga. During the symposium, Yanaga meets mission leader John Mitchell and presents him with a small handheld compass. He shakes hands with Rex Barber and the other American pilots. An official oral history interview is recorded on April 15, 1988, now archived through the Portal to Texas History. Video documentation captures panel discussions featuring Yanaga alongside American pilots including Frank Holmes, Louis Kittle, Jack Jacobson, Douglas Canning, and Roger Ames. Yanaga lives another 20 years after the symposium, giving interviews and appearing in documentaries. He maintains that the failure to protect Yamamoto was inevitable given the circumstances: obsolescent aircraft, outdated doctrine, and facing an enemy who knew exactly when and where to strike. On February 29, 2008, Kenji Yanaga dies at age 88, the last witness to one of World War II's most consequential minutes. The failure to protect Admiral Yamamoto on April 18, 1943, was ultimately a failure of technology and intelligence rather than courage or skill. The Zero, revolutionary in 1940, was dangerously obsolescent by 1943. Its lack of armour, self-sealing fuel tanks, and most critically competitive speed made it incapable of countering American boom and zoom tactics. The P-38 Lightning could engage and disengage at will, dictating the terms of combat in a way that negated the Zero's advantages in manoeuvrability. The A6M3 Model 22's maximum speed of 388 miles per hour at 19,690 feet was significantly slower than the P-38's 414 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. The Lightning's twin Allison engines produced 2,800 to 3,450 combined horsepower versus the Zero's single 1,130 horsepower Sakai 21. The P-38 could climb 1,650 feet per minute, faster than the Zero, and maintained superior performance above 20,000 feet, thanks to its turbo superchargers. The breaking of the JN-25D cipher represents one of the greatest intelligence successes in military history. The detailed itinerary broadcast by the Japanese gave the Americans everything needed for the interception. The message, sent to multiple commands as part of post-Operation I-Go coordination, specified exact times and locations. This intelligence coup was magnified by Japanese overconfidence in their code security and failure to implement basic operational security measures. The Japanese Navy's inability to conceive that their codes might be compromised persisted even after Yamamoto's death. While some officers suspected the Americans had been warned, the Navy leadership rejected the possibility that JN-25D had been broken. This willful blindness allowed American codebreakers to continue reading Japanese communications for months afterward. The positioning of the escort reflected tactics developed against inferior Chinese opposition in the late 1930s. The assumption that attacks would come from above, the spacing that prevented mutual support, and the altitude differential that made rapid intervention impossible all contributed to the failure. The 6-0 pilots were positioned in two V formations of 3 aircraft each, at approximately 6,500 feet, 1,500 feet above and behind the two Betty bombers. Japanese fighter doctrine emphasized individual skill over coordinated tactics, while American pilots trained extensively in mutual support techniques like the thatch weave. Japanese pilots were expected to prevail through superior airmanship. This worked when Japanese pilots held qualitative edge in both aircraft and experience. But by 1943, American pilots were increasingly well-trained and flying superior aircraft. For the 6-0 pilots who flew escort on April 18, 1943, the failure defined the remainder of their lives. Within 3 months, 4 were dead. Hidaka and Okazaki on June 7th, Morisaki on June 16th, and Tsujinue missing on July 1st. Shoichi Sugita survived until April 15, 1945, accumulating 70 official victories before dying during a takeoff scramble at Kanoya. Only Kenji Yanaga survived the war, living with the burden of failure until 2008. The 204th Air Group, from which all 6 escorts came, suffered severe losses throughout 1943. The unit had been formed on November 1, 1942, by renaming the 6th Air Group and operated from Rabaul during the Solomon Islands campaign. By war's end, few of its original pilots survived. Yamamoto's death dealt a psychological blow to Japan from which it never recovered. He was not merely a fleet commander, but the intellectual architect of Japanese naval strategy. His understanding of American industrial capacity, his warnings about protracted war, and his ability to conceive operations like Pearl Harbor made him irreplaceable. His successor, Admiral Minichi Koga, lacked Yamamoto's vision and charisma. For the Americans, the successful assassination validated their intelligence capabilities and demonstrated their growing ability to execute complex long-range operations. The mission became a template for similar operations throughout the Pacific War. 18 P-38s were initially assigned to Operation Vengeance, though only 16 actually flew after 2 developed mechanical problems during startup. The failure to protect Yamamoto was not a failure of the 6 escort pilots, but a failure of the entire Japanese military system by 1943. It represents the moment when individual courage and skill could no longer compensate for technological and intelligence disadvantages. The 0 pilots did everything their training and doctrine prescribed, but their training and doctrine were fatally flawed. Could the 0 escort have saved Yamamoto if positioned differently? The harsh answer is probably not. Even if they had spotted the P-38s seconds earlier, even if positioned lower, the speed and firepower advantage of the American fighters was decisive. The P-38s needed only seconds to destroy the unarmoured Betty bombers. The Zeros might have made the attack more costly, but they could not have prevented it. The story of why the Japanese pilots failed to protect Admiral Yamamoto is thus not merely a tale of a single mission gone wrong, but a microcosm of Japan's larger defeat in the Pacific War. It demonstrates how technological superiority, intelligence advantage, and tactical innovation can overwhelm traditional military virtues like courage, skill, and dedication. The 6-0 pilots represented experienced naval aviation, but by April 1943, experience was no longer enough. The mission occurred at the culmination of Operation Waigo, Yamamoto's last offensive that claimed to have sunk 1 cruiser, 2 destroyers, and 25 transports while destroying 175 Allied aircraft. Actual Allied losses were approximately 25 aircraft and several ships. The operation involved concentrating 350 aircraft, including carrier planes from Zuikaku, Zuiho, Junyo, and Hiyo, for strikes between April 1st and 16th, 1943. Japanese losses totaled 55 aircraft. Yamamoto was flying to congratulate the units that participated in Operation I-Go, when American intelligence, having broken the JN-25D code, learned of his exact itinerary. The precision of American planning, 16 P-38s navigating 420 miles in radio silence to arrive at exactly 0935 hours, represents the evolution of American capabilities by 1943. The wreckage of Betty Bomber No. 323 remains in the Bougainville jungle, a memorial to Admiral Yamamoto and his staff. The 6-0 pilots who failed to protect him are remembered primarily through Yanaga's testimony. Their failure deserves consideration, for it encapsulates the tragedy of the Imperial Japanese Navy in the Pacific War. Skilled warriors undone by technological inferiority, doctrinal rigidity, and intelligence failures. Kenji Yanaga died on February 29, 2008, at age 88, the last witness to one of World War II's most consequential minutes. With his passing, the story of the Yamamoto escort passed from living memory into history. But the lessons remain relevant: the danger of technological complacency, the importance of intelligence security, the need for doctrine to evolve with circumstances, and ultimately the limits of human courage in the face of systematic disadvantage. The 6-0 pilots who flew on April 18, 1943, were not failures. They were men asked to do the impossible, and their inability to achieve it marked not their inadequacy, but the beginning of the end for Imperial Japan. They flew obsolescent aircraft, followed outdated doctrine, and faced an enemy who knew exactly when and where to strike. Their story represents one of the Pacific War's most poignant tragedies. Warriors defeated not by lack of courage, but by the changing nature of war itself.